Thank you for the intro. Let's see, so real quick, so my background is that I studied computational neuroscience with applications to hearing science. So I worked on a really great variety of models ranging from, I got handed a 10,000 line C code base from the 90s, and that's supposed to be a biophysical model of the auditory nerve. And then I also, towards the end of my degree, was starting to work on open public data sets and using, more statistical learning, kind of classic ML approaches. And then I graduated right before large language models really exploded as a widely available tool. After I did my PhD, I worked on at open source software. I was at data version control, so I spent a lot of time doing some code contributions, but largely advocating among data scientists and data science practitioners, whatever job title they're under, about some principles of reproducibility in software engineering, and learning a lot about the really varied and complicated workflows that people have. And now I am on the teaching faculty at the University of Michigan, and I also run a very small research lab of me, and one student right now. Yeah, so I'm there. We're not a Viz center, but I'm really looking forward to learning a lot more about what you all are doing, because it's such a cool model, and it's so different from the kind of things that I'm used to seeing. So the work that I'm going to show you today is the last couple years of work, and it's made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Technology Fund. So jumping right into it, code is pretty critical to science research. So there's the, data generating simulations is one way, right, where we might run something on a cluster that's going to simulate, thousands and thousands of different parameter combinations perhaps. But also in data collection, so we're seeing all sorts of really interesting moves, like in cognitive neuroscience and psychology. A lot of people are now using JavaScript because if they are designing browser-based experiments to collect data online. So there's suddenly all of these people using JavaScript that 5 years ago weren't, and they're in psychology. Statistical modeling, and I mean this really broadly, right? This is from our t-tests, our statistical significance tests, to our predictive modeling, very broadly defined. Most of statistical analysis requires some software. Visualization, even scientists that work in wet labs are often using software to visualize. They might be in MATLAB or Matplotlib, whatever their chosen tooling is. But there's very few parts of science, even well outside disciplines that we think of as predominantly computational, that doesn't have scientists interfacing with programming in some capacity. So where are we now? Now with code LLMs, right? So having shown up in the last couple years, and I'm going to use this pretty umbrella term here, code LLMs, to basically mean any way that somebody could possibly use an LLM-based tool as part of their programming toolkit. So I mean this term, this could include somebody who's programming with ChatGPT. It could be something like Claude Code that's going to set you up with kind of some agentic workflow, setting up tests for you, setting up an environment. Could be an autocomplete kind of tool inside your IDE. Super, super broad perspective here. So what's the allure of using these sort of tools? You might know by now that a lot of scientists we don't receive a lot of training in programming. I think most of us receive probably one class now, but it often doesn't really cover what are most of the the activities that are involved in working on a real project that has messy data. You have to set up your own computing environment. You might have to work in libraries that are kind of specialized for the type of work you do. So we don't receive a ton of developer education, and I'd argue that what we do receive might not prepare us especially well for the realities of scientific work. So that's pretty well established now. A lot of programmers seem to really like using these tools, this new crop of tools. So in studies, there's a lot of human-computer interaction literature that studies programmers broadly. So a lot of these studies are just, intro Python programmers. We can get some, CS 101 Python students, or similar, and we can ask them, about their experience using various tools, whether that's a chat tool or an autocomplete. And there are a lot of studies showing that people like using them, that they are generally enjoying the process. But there's also some risks that turn up in these studies. One of them is that understanding and debugging code that you didn't write is actually pretty hard. So for a lot of people, even when they perceive that they're getting faster or more productive when they're working with a large language model-based tool, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're having an easier time in terms of like how much time it's taking to actually arrive at a working solution that meets your specifications. Because of producing code becomes rather easy, making sure it did what you want is hard. And actually from the literature on how people learn to debug, a pretty big part of the debugging process seems to be making a mental model of what your code does. And so if you didn't actually produce the code yourself on the first pass, then you still have to do the work of coming up with the mental model so you can debug it. Inaccuracies in code and explanations about code are also a liability. So I do know this changes, the degree of inaccuracy and what types of errors can change a bit from model to model and year over year, but I don't currently know of anyone that doesn't have some, challenges with getting code out that really does do what they wanted it to do, meets specifications, matches their intent. And also there are issues with the explanations as well, that we still see a lot of incorrect explanations about what code does can also happen. And one thing that I think of as a particular liability in scientific settings is that we don't have a very long history and culture of using code testing practices. This is kind of a long-standing issue. It's just not a very big part of a lot of scientific communities. There is a lot of variance. Some places where there are like communal code bases that are shared, you really do see, some large communal projects will have like automated testing when somebody, wants to merge a PR into the repository. But I would say that is probably a very, very small % of the total, the range of code bases. I also don't mean this to say that nobody inspects or validates their code in any way. It's just not through a systematic practice usually. It's usually more of, let me sit down and I'm going to feel out what does the output look like, is this what I expect, but it's not necessarily standardized. So I'm just going to present now a couple of data points about what's actually happening right now. By right now, this is a study that I presented, it was published in May, so it's data that was collected last summer. So everything LLMs, moves fairly fast. So this is about 1-year-old interviews and surveys. So the first thing I did was conduct a survey just of scientists at my university. So this is the University of Michigan, so we're a pretty large public research institution. We have especially a large medical school too, so you might notice that showing up in some of my data, that we have a big representation of biomedical researchers here. So one thing I wanted to find out is just what are the general characteristics of people that were using any kind of LLM-based tool in their programming. And which tools are they using? So the inclusion criteria was just, are you a researcher? And that can be any career stage. That could be a student. That could be a tenured faculty member that programs regularly. So at least about once a month or more for their research. If somebody who really never programs is not the audience for this. And that they use some kind of LLM-based tool at least some of the time in their research-related programming. So if they just use it at home on the weekend to make a stock trading app, not relevant. And so we have 199 responses to this. And so one of the first findings is that really chatbots were the dominant mode here. So people are not using developer-specific tools. So asking them what tools are you using on the regular, most people were using a ChatGPT variant, either the one that is hosted by OpenAI or the one that the University of Michigan provides, which is, I think we have some sort of, it just makes API calls and returns people, their own chat interface, but it's in the University of Michigan browser, setup. So it's actually a strong minority of it's a really asymmetrical distribution here. People are not tending to use developer specialized tools. They're not working with tools that are in their developer environment. They tend to have a browser window open and they're going to ChatGPT. And this is interesting to me for a few reasons. One of them being that chat tends to give you longer suggestions. So you probably know this just by feel, but if you are playing with, something like Visual Studio Code and you have your Copilot plugin, it tends to give you kind of these small to medium chunks of suggestions which you can tab through. But ChatGPT is a much more verbose kind of tool. There's some variance in this based on the models, based on how they're tuned with the reinforcement learning stage, but it's often fairly verbose, and it doesn't have an issue giving you tens, hundreds of lines of code, and it will do that. So to me, that just strikes me immediately as a little bit nerve-wracking because of, I think, the scale of code that people could be generating in one pass is possibly bigger, and that seems to me, not having very strong evidence for this empirically, but that seems to me like a bigger burden to check what it's created versus if you're just tabbing through and taking, an autocomplete line or two. Most of the respondents were not in a traditionally computational domain, and again, this is not a census, and I don't have data. This chart here isn't showing who's not using it, because if I was just surveying people who do use something. But life sciences was really the dominant sort of category here. And then we have a lot of folks that are in fields like psychology, social sciences, physical sciences, geosciences. I know some of that can be, computational in nature, kind of baked in. But really the majority users here are not people that are getting highly specialized programming education. Programming might be a method that is a small part of what they do, but they certainly don't work on computer systems as like their primary, topic. Another finding, which I don't know, I haven't been able to find this like really cited in the literature before, but it feels like something that I can't imagine it's not published somewhere, is that it's kind of typical for people to be programming in more than one language on the regular. So asking people about what are the, your dominant programming languages that you're typically using during your research, a slight majority are multilingual. The median number of languages was 2. And there were a lot of reasons for this, which I'll discuss, but it turned out to matter here when I was doing some interviews. So I basically followed up with some people that left interesting use cases in the survey. I asked them, what are you using this for? And then I picked, kind of to maximize the diversity of different use cases and backgrounds. So going in for some interviews with folks, and I then had these interviews with about like, what are you actually doing? Can you show me your logs? And can you tell me how you verify generated code? And a limitation on this method here is that I'm not watching them in the moment do it. So a self-report of how do you verify it, there can be some veracity issues there, but this is a first pass of what is your thought process of how you verify this. So 14 interviews, 10 of them were with user logs, and that's, they used ChatGPT or some variant of it, so I was able to say, can you just give me a snapshot or a PDF of some of the user logs for the things that we're talking about today? And people really generously shared that. So what are they using these tools for? Mostly it's kind of an info retrieval tool for unfamiliar programming languages and libraries. So in some ways this is not that different from, that everybody needs to look up, wait, what's the method for this? What's the API call for this? And then, sometimes you want to look that up without having to go into your docs. So maybe you just want to, autocomplete it and see if that works. But what's really particular about these scientists is that it's not often that they're necessarily forgetting. It's not, I don't remember how to do this. It can equally as often be, I've just never worked in this programming language before. I learned, in my one programming class, it was in R, and now I work in a lab that uses Python. So can you tell me how I would do this in Python? That tends to be kind of what's going on here. Or even within a language, the variance across packages can be so different. Like something like Python is such a kind of sprawling language in terms of the conventions can differ a lot by the package about how objects are treated, right? Or is this more of a vector sort of, what's the kind of the primary data structure? And so that can pose a lot of challenges too for folks. So kind of one quote that just exemplified this was, every question that I have, I put into ChatGPT whether it's how do I extract a variable in a column to do X, or much more complicated tasks such as how do I adapt the format of a graph. So it's kind of a documentation replacement, for better or for worse. And so why are there so many of these language changes? What is going on? There's a lot of reasons for it. One reason is changing labs. So we have very high turnover in the sciences. It's very common that someone will work for a couple months as a research assistant, then they'll move on to get their PhD. They might rotate through a few labs there. Then they're gonna do their postdoc where they will switch again, and then maybe another postdoc, and then maybe they'll start a lab. So it can happen that every time you change labs, you might have to learn a different language or a different library or set of libraries. There's legacy code. So in some research groups, there is a code base. It could be maybe a Fortran code base that has been sitting there for quite some time, and it's still used regularly. And yet we are not teaching most of our students Fortran anymore. So you might have to work in something older. Collaboration. A lot of times when people are collaborating, someone will say, well, I only can work in this language, you can only work in this language, so we really have to, put them together. So sometimes people will collaborate in a language they are not super familiar with just in order to, they'll try to go out of their way to meet their collaborator where they're at. Specialty tools, so there's a lot of people who are mixing and matching of like, well, I do this in R, but really the best package for, maybe like Bayesian, Bayesian Monte Carlo methods or something is going to be in Python. So there's a bit of mixing and matching too for what do you need for a particular part of your software stack. There's also changing field norms. So a lot of people that I speak to are saying, well, we used to be a MATLAB field, but we care about open science a lot, and so the field is moving towards Python, and we're trying to switch to that. So I did ask a lot of people after I started noticing this, why not use the docs? And almost across the board, not everyone, but quite a lot of people are saying just, the docs are very hard for me to use. So this is actually from someone who had been programming for, I think, more than 20 years. And they were writing, ChatGPT is just 1,000 times easier than the docs, just ridiculously easier. And this is from someone who said, I don't program, I actually have no years of programming experience until when they started in the lab, and then I think they had been there for about a year, until I had enough coding experience. I didn't even look at the documentation because I would open it, read it, and there were so many words that I didn't understand, so I just closed it. But these days I also don't read them because I realized I can ask ChatGPT to read them and then apply the information to my code. So to me, I feel a bit sad for the docs because I'm seeing a lot of people who are using this to say, ChatGPT, show me how I would use pandas to do this. And in the docs are these perfectly working examples of exactly how you would do this that are guaranteed to work and have correct information in them. But people they're not really able to use them very well. So they really would prefer in a lot of cases to use ChatGPT rather than navigate the docs directly. So the matter of verification, I just was asking people, how do you know what's correct? Can you walk me through an example of how did you decide if this code was acceptable? And so interestingly, most people expressed confidence. Most people said things like, I always check, I always look at it, I never just blindly accept it. But the strategies that are being used are mostly a form of eyeballing. So eyeballing is kind of just glancing and saying it looked right or it didn't look right. But when I cross-referenced with people's user logs, it was clear that there were some failures of this. And I don't have an incidence rate for this, because remember, I have 10 user logs here. But I am saying that 3 of my conversations turned up medium serious code errors that were not caught immediately by the user who was eyeballing it. So some verification failures. So for example, one person wanted to generate code. It was interesting. They took a scientific paper and they wanted to use the methods section from that paper to generate code that would match the methods section. And so they were trying to do something. It was an event detection with a smoothing window. And the smoothing window came out it was either half the size or double the size, but it wasn't the right smoothing window size, and the event detection didn't deduplicate anything, even though it had a code block in the comment that said it would deduplicate, but the logic would never be triggered. It was interesting. And so it didn't actually work as specified, but the person had read it, but I don't think that it had been tested with like any kind of code, like not really significant code coverage. And so I did point this out to the person, and they had not actually realized that. Another one is explaining differences between code versions incorrectly. So this was an example where someone had received legacy code in the lab in, I think it was JavaScript, and the person didn't read JavaScript. So what they did was they had two different versions of the code, and they asked ChatGPT to explain what's the difference between these two and which one should I use. And the explanation it gave about what was different about them was not correct based on, I just could read the code. And another one was someone else was putting several hundred lines of code into ChatGPT and saying, can you modify this to change a feature? It was for running some equipment that would do instrumentation, some recording. And they just asked it, add a feature, and then give me back the whole code. And it actually removed some other code that would turn on the recording instrument. So in that case, the person did catch it eventually, but not from their read of the code. It was when they came back to the lab and their instrumentation had not run the night before. And I think that's really interesting because it reveals that I think they're treating this as if it's doing like a diff, that it can say, add a feature and deterministically return everything else unchanged, rather than being sensitive to this property of LLMs, which is super weird, I think, for a lot of people to conceive of, which is that, you know, they may or may not perfectly return the same code before because of its probabilistic. It didn't actually do a deterministic diff. And so the reason I'm saying that these are not necessarily scientific failures is I don't know that any of these would have seriously affected the end result of their research project. So in science, right, we often are going for like a conclusion, right? We're trying to study something and we're testing a hypothesis, often, not always, but usually, you know, there's some hypothesis being tested, and generally, the things that we're trying to make claims about, they should be true under a variety of parameterizations. If something, so this thing about maybe giving it the wrong smoothing window, if I change the width of my smoothing window by, you know, 1%, if that drastically changes my result and gives me a completely different direction result, that's actually sort of suspect for the result, right? So things should be somewhat robust. They should not be highly, dependent on our parameters. And there's a whole area of kind of meta-science research about multiverse theory, which is, how robust are our parameterizations, our conclusions to our parameterizations and our experimental choices. So I don't want to go so far to say that this has, ruined the science that they were working on. But my point here is just to say that I am seeing some, small n anecdotal here, but clearly I think that the ability to, the confidence that you have checked your code when you're eyeballing may not correspond very clearly to a set of defined activities for what it means to quality control or to check your code. So one additional finding, which I didn't really expect, was that some participants had these really unusual mental models of what the tools they were using were doing. So, for example, I could see for some people, if they're using the university-provided ChatGPT, it has never had browser access. It doesn't have a plugin to do a web search. So I would sometimes hear in the interviews I would say, how do you think it comes up with the answer for this? Or how do you know that this is, a trustworthy answer? And they'll say, well, I think it just did a Google search, pulled up the answer from the docs, and reported it back to me. But that wasn't actually happening. And that doesn't mean that the answer is incorrect, because if the correct answer could have been in the training data and memorized. But perhaps if you believe that it arrived at the answer through a different mechanistic pathway than it really did, that might affect your confidence. Another thing that was interesting to me was describing tools doing calculations or running code. So someone comparing the university ChatGPT, which has not had a code interpreter ever, to Wolfram Alpha, so thinking that it's working like an algebraic engine or that it calls a calculator. I did hear some conversations about running code or testing code. you know, assuming, and this I think has been found in a couple other studies too, just as a one-off kind of note, that sometimes more junior programmers will assume that ChatGPT or similar conversational tools have somehow checked the code before they give it to you, so that they won't return something if it isn't correct in some way. But of course, for a lot of these tools, there isn't a code interpreter present. And I feel quite, I don't know, a little lucky I did this last year because I think that at the time, maybe it made sense looking forward into the future to think, well, this problem will go away as tools converge on having all of the plugins available. But I actually think the landscape has gotten weirder and more varied instead of more uniform. So for example, this was April 2025 when OpenAI released O3. So O3 was one of their reasoning tools, I think. And so this one, by default, whenever somebody used it just on the platform by default, it would call a code interpreter if it decided that there was a programming, you know, or a computational task. So if you asked it to do some math, it would try to translate that into a Python script usually, and then it would actually execute that in a code interpreter module and return the answer. And it would show you, optionally, you could toggle to see what code was executed as well as its output. So we have the same, and so here's an example. If I give it this hideous table and I say, find me the correlation between X and Y, it will translate, it will copy as best as it can that you know, data frame object, right, that table, into you know, a real data table in pandas, and it will actually compute the correlation, and I have some trace here to what was done. I still wouldn't do this because I don't love the idea of saying, hey, just like LLM, remember the numbers and put them in. I'd much rather do that programmatically, but at least there's a trace of the computation. So the exact same model hosted by our university, it does not have a code interpreter module. So if I give it that exact same, you know, prompt, it will tell me that it calculated the correlation, but it didn't, and that's the wrong number. So the same model can have wildly different array of plugins associated with it, and I don't think that people are broadly, especially casual users, I don't think they're super sensitive to that. I think it's pretty hard to navigate. Like, I will regularly talk to very, very smart people who are not sure when a tool is doing a web search versus not, and I'll sometimes point to it on the screen and be like, did you notice that? And they'll say, no, there's just too much going on, I didn't notice that. So I do think there's something of a user interface problem here with the affordances of the tool not being obvious, and I don't know that it's necessarily shifting towards a very clear, you know, profile of tools being available through every LLM-based tool. So survey number 3, an even bigger survey. This is not published yet. I'm writing it up right now, but I'm super excited about this. This was data collected the last month in August. Is that I wanted to conduct a bigger survey, so not just people at University of Michigan. And the question that I was after is, how does perceived productivity with code LLMs relate to the actual development practices that people are using? And this question is kind of inspired by the fact that when people tell me they're checking, I don't know what that corresponds to in terms of actual activities. So I wanted to see, does your perception of how productive you are depend on if you have any standardized practices? Do you do code review? Do you have any testing? Do you use version control? And I also wanted to find out who's not using code LLMs and why. So my first survey was just asking people, you know, you do use it, tell me about it. But that doesn't get at anybody who chose not to use it or who gave up. So, you know, this is kind of inspired by, has anybody read this study this is from GitHub. So this is the team at GitHub, and this was their internal study of perceived productivity among developers who were early users of Copilot. So what they did was they were surveying these users, and they have access to something I don't, which is their user logs, which is super cool. And so they used a perceived productivity scale, which I'll show you an example of it. It's a questionnaire, and they didn't create this just for this. It has some existing literature about what are some of the dimensions of what makes developers, you know, feel productive. And they found that if they want to predict how productive people feel when they're using Copilot, one predictor is programming experience. So people who are less experienced programmers tend to report being more productive. And also it's not really, actually, it wasn't exactly the number, it was the rate. It's number normalized by time frequency, but time, the time bin, but the rate of accepting suggestions from Copilot. So people who are accepting a lot of suggestions, who are frequently saying, yes, tab, yes, I want that, they tend to feel more productive than people who don't. I think one positive interpretation of this is that beginners have the most to gain. I think I also have a concern of what if beginners just don't have very good feedback about what they're looking for, and so everything just feels productive. I don't know which is the case here, but to me, I don't think it's very obvious what the interpretation is here of is this good or bad for software. So this work here is a partnership. I've got Jeff Carver and Nasir Isti they're both experts in software studies of how scientists program, and particularly they have a lot of survey work about testing practices and general software standards in research code. Alexis is a recent master's student who is at the University of Michigan, about to go for her PhD. And so she's been helping me with analyzing, preparing the survey and doing analysis of the reasons that people choose not to use code LLMs. So the survey demographics here, again, I want any scientist who programs as part of their research. We got about 1,200 responses, but after making sure that we have complete responses from people who program, we got 868 folks. We have a heavy skew towards the United States here, probably just because that's where me and my co-authors have our professional networks. So for this group, we found that adoption is common, but it's not total. So asking people about how often are you using any code LLM in your programming, it's a pretty symmetrical distribution where the fraction of people who are saying, I've never tried, or I tried and gave up, is actually pretty similar to the proportion that are saying most of the time or always. So we have a pretty big spread of what's happening, and of course the modal response is sometimes. So adoption is not, it's not like a completely finished process here at all. There are, as expected, some differences in adoption. So pretty high adoption in computer and information services. Oh, and these categories, these are domain categories that are from the NSF's taxonomy. So there's, I've asked people to sort themselves into the category that they think best represents their research, but of course these are not perfect, and people may potentially have more than one category they could belong to, even though I asked them to pick one. But there is quite a bit of variance in this. Interesting to me is that I thought engineering was going to be like computer science, but it's not. It's kind of computer science and then everybody else. Students and junior programmers are the most likely to say that they're using a code LLM often, so the adoption tends to skew younger. Faculty might also just be programming a bit less, so perhaps that's part of it, but we are seeing a lot of preferential adoption the younger you go. And interestingly, although this is a small sample size, it's not a huge group here, but the research software engineers have the highest rate of non-adoption, interestingly. And once again, chat is king. So asking people about their primary tool, so the tool they're using most, just looking at these, ChatGPT is really, really on top here. And what's it? We have, when I tally these up, a general purpose chat tool, whichever one it is, that's 472 versus 88 that I classified as a developer tool, which would be something like GitHub Copilot or Claude Code, so something that's really designed as a programming tool first. So here's the, to me the most interesting. How productive do code LLM users feel, and what is driving this? So what did we do here? So the productivity scale is adapted from the GitHub study, so as similar as possible, swapping out, making it generic written, so it didn't say like when using Copilot I swapped out, for using this tool. So asking people to rate on this kind of Likert scale from strongly disagree to agree, And in theory, this is a model that has, 5 dimensions. The GitHub team found, and I also found, that the dimensions are all completely correlated with one another, and there's not actually very strong evidence for 5 unique factors. So the way that we report this, just like they do, is by averaging everything together. And we also have a development practice scale. So we started by asking people, are you familiar with any of these concepts? So version control, code testing, code review, and continuous integration. And we just sort of picked these as kind of a sampling of some practices that are, somewhat regular software development practices. And then for people who indicated they are familiar with the concept, we asked them, how much do you use this? Always, most of the time, about half the time, sometimes, or never. And we asked about 3 kinds of testing: unit, regression, and system. The reason we picked those is that a survey previously done by the Carver team had found those were the 3 most likely to be used kinds of tests by research software producers that they had studied. And they found a pretty low usage rate of those. I think it was in like the 25%-ish. So I didn't ask about things that were pretty rare in their sample. So just sort of putting everything together in a confusion matrix, one finding is that the perceived productivity score, sort of the global score, is negatively associated with every single software development practice. So every single one of them across the board, if you are using that practice, you are less likely to perceive yourself as gaining a lot of productivity from your chosen large language model tool. Programming experience is also negatively associated with perceiving productivity. So that's pretty similar to what the GitHub team found, that if you are a more junior programmer, you tend to perceive yourself as getting more productivity. And there's an interesting interaction between programming experience and your use of the development practices. So what I mean by this is, if we just plot the years of programming experience on the x-axis and their perceived productivity score, if I do a median split, if I take the bottom 50th percentile of low development score users, so people who don't tend to use a lot of testing, version control, code review, they just are either unfamiliar with them or they don't use them very much. There's this relationship, this linear relationship on the log scale here with how much programming experience you have and how much productivity you feel like you're getting. So for these folks, there is a relationship. But if we go into this group here, which is if we add this split, so this is people with relatively high use of development practices in the upper 50th percentile, it's a much flatter relationship, and this is quite significant. And I didn't really anticipate this. This turned out to be the best fitting model. If I had to guess what this is if you don't have access to code quality feedback signals through any practices, then your experience is what helps you, kind of assess your code quality, and you use that to kind of test it out to get a more accurate gauge of what's going on in your code. But if you do have access to feedback signals, then you don't have to rely as much on your years of experience to gauge how much your code is improving or not. That's just a hypothesis. I don't know if that's the explanation. And one maybe surprise finding is that generating more lines of code was the strongest predictor of how productive you feel. So I asked people, how many lines of generated code suggestions do you typically accept at one time when working with this tool? The reason that we can't ask them, like, how often do you accept, is because most of these people are not using a tool that's in their IDE. It's not an autocomplete tool. So it's a sort of different experience. They're opening up ChatGPT for the most part, and then they're generating code and copying and pasting that into their development environment. And note that this question does not imply that they don't edit the code after, right? So I'm not tracking, and I have no way of tracking how much they change the code. And some people even wrote in, I love to generate like thousands of lines of code for a skeleton of a project, and then I modify a lot of it. So there's a pretty big range of practices here, so I don't want to say that this means they are wholesale accepting and then like committing and shipping that code. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening. But this was the biggest predictor of perceived productivity, is that people who wrote that they are taking more than 100 lines typically out of ChatGPT are feeling the most productive with that tool, versus people who don't use generative AI to produce code suggestions directly. So they're more likely to say, like, just what's the function for this, or how, give me an example, and then they write the code themselves. They're, tend to be the least productive feeling. So the findings here are, I don't know, they seem pretty clear to me that as far as the associations go, perceived productivity with a code LLM tool is inversely related to how much code feedback mechanisms exist in your research group and also your experience. But really important to note that this is not a causal experiment, right? So this is a survey at one point in time, and I don't know for sure that if we started giving people code testing, if we gave them code review, I don't know that that would modify their perceived productivity. And it's also possible that people are using code LLMs for very different types of things depending on how much experience they have. So I don't have a very strong control here for what tasks they're doing. So this is, the survey cannot answer those types of questions. That's future directions. So the next thing I want to talk about is, why do people not adopt? So for people that indicated that they've either given up after trying or that they just they've never tried, we directed them to this question about, you indicated you don't really use any of these tools. Why do you think that is? And we have done some qualitative coding, separating out, like, we don't keep track of their demographic info in the same spreadsheet. We just have a long list of their responses and then qualitatively coding those to find themes. So just a high-level kind of picture here. The dominant theme is about self-reliance, about not wanting to offload the work of programming and feeling a threat to their own learning and development. Then the next biggest category is a broad term, umbrella of ethical issues, when there's a huge number of distinct ethical issues that people are concerned with. For some folks, there was just no demand. They don't feel that they program enough to warrant exploring another tool. And then for some, there's also issues with inefficiency of not saving time and the accuracy of the tools. So just to give some examples, because I think quotes are usually the most helpful way to understand this. Here's a person who's talking about the kind of self-reliance theme. I've occasionally used them when I'm stuck, but I really want to improve my coding skills, and I think the best way to do so is to write the code myself and to work through bugs. This is an example of some of the ethical kind of concerns. I'm generally opposed to generative AI because of concern over the ethics of the training of the models, i.e. stolen data, concern about the climate impact of generative AI, and then this person also writes about the accuracy, which is its own theme. And here's a fairly indicative example of the inefficiency angle. It takes more time to figure out what is wrong when I don't write the code. So for some people, they're saying, I'm just not seeing a lot of time savings with the tools that I've tried. So conclusions here. Adoption is skewing junior. Oop. How did I do that? The modal scientific programmer using AI has a ChatGPT window open. They are not using the same tools that professional developers might be using in their IDEs. And perceived productivity indexes heavily on the generating part of code and not the other parts of the software development process. And that's super interesting to me. I mean, thinking about what goes into software development, industrially, I feel like when I talk to people who are professional developers, very few people would say that making a lot of code, the lines of code, is a good indicator of how productive you've been, right? I mean, oftentimes we'll want to remove code, we want to refactor. There's often, it just isn't a quality metric. And yet it feels that for this group here, most of the perceived productivity hinges predominantly on the producing the code. And I don't know what that means for code quality, but it is seeming to drive a lot of the perceived productivity gains. So what does this mean for science? And I just want to zoom like way far out to thinking about how science works, how we publish, how we share knowledge. So code quality issues in science are quite old, and I suspect that's a very big part of why initiatives like this exist. A lot of scientific code is challenging to test. We might not know what is the ground truth that we should be testing against. Adoption of software engineering practices is highly inconsistent. It varies a lot across disciplines, across labs, and some of this can be that there might not be a very good fit between the workflows that scientists have and the kind of practices that are used in other settings. But there is a pretty big variance in terms of how we quality control check our code. And there are some long-standing observations, I mean, for many years now, about scientists having in various contexts a tendency to assume code works or is good and use it, and we don't have a lot of skepticism towards our code. And I don't know if this is a robust, does it occur across every context or not, but it has been noted with regard to how people use spreadsheet programming. So people tend to trust that things in spreadsheets compute answers are generally correct without doing a lot of verification, and scientists are often very likely to use other people's code or libraries without doing a thorough investigation of, is this up to my standards? So what is new here exactly? Is anything new at all? So I would argue that one thing that's changed is that the old barrier to using code for science is the runtime error. So if for a lot of folks who have trained as scientists who have to program in the past, if they were given some code in their lab and they wanted to write a paper that in some way hinged on that code, they had to make the code work. And it was often code that was written by somebody else from the lab, and they have to adapt it now for their data. And if you can't make it work, if you can't understand what it does, you cannot make it run, and you will never get a number or a picture out of that code. The code LLMs are generally very good at helping people push past runtime errors. They're very good at solving syntax errors. They're getting better all the time as context windows grow. And kind of a downside in some ways to this is that now the errors that people are encountering are actually harder errors. They are more subtle. They are more likely to be semantic errors wherein your code runs and it produces a figure or it produces a number or some other kind of output. And yet the error is that it didn't do it by the mechanism that you thought, or that is not the correct numbers, or it encodes assumptions that you don't match yours. So this is a much more subtle kind of issue, and so I do have a concern that we're essentially speed running our most junior programmers to having to deal with that kind of debugging when they haven't cut their teeth on the basic bugs. And remember, the point of debugging is not to make your code run, it's part of building a mental model of what your code actually does. So if we have more runnable scientific code contributed by more people with more varied backgrounds, that could strain our existing quality control mechanisms, which are already kind of strained and with more subtle errors. So one thing to remember too is that for scientists, we are generally not evaluated on our code, we are evaluated on our scientific output, which even though so much has improved and changed towards recognition of the value of code, it's still for most of us papers. Unfortunately, most places that I am, and when I'm evaluated on my research productivity, it's usually through papers, no matter how much any code I might make is being used or anything. I mean, it's kind of sad still that this is the case, but this is true for a lot of scientists. And so scientific publishing is not a perfect mirror of the code work that we do. It sort of is a warped perspective on it. So a few things to keep in mind. One is that publication bias is present. And what that means is that we have a tendency in many scientific disciplines to put papers that have a null effect in the file drawer. So if you test something and the result is not significant, or it suggests whatever you were studying isn't, we can't detect any effect here, you put that in your file drawer and you just don't publish that because nobody's going to publish, that paper. But if you get a significant effect, then you get a paper and you get cited more. And so that has sort of contributed to maybe an overestimate on average on the scientific literature of how big a lot of published effects are. So you can kind of think of we've got a high pass filter here. So only things that are really big in one direction tend to get published. So if you had a code error that led you to underestimate something, that probably won't get published, but if your code error causes you to overestimate the effect size of something, that is more likely to be published and read and shared. Then we also have this kind of cognitive filter, and this is that we tend to sort of discretize papers into this one-bit signal of it's significant or not significant. This may be different in different fields, but coming from like the neuroscience world, we are very prone to this of saying, well, X was significant, so it's real and big and meaningful, and the other thing isn't significant, so it's not. We don't study that anymore. So we also have kind of a way of seriously compressing, what's in a paper. So one thing that gets floated a lot when I talk about these issues is, well, what if we all just published our code? Wouldn't that be great? And it would be great. I would like everyone to publish their code, but I don't actually think it's going to solve a lot of our quality control problems. So most published scientific code repositories are not showing signs of reuse. So this was a 2020, so it's a couple years old, but kind of a GitHub mining exercise. The distribution of repositories by the number of stars on GitHub and the number of forks. Obviously, neither of these are perfect proxies for reuse, but it really looks like the median number of stars and forks for a lot of these is pretty close to 0. So if you are publishing code and it is getting reused by people outside your group, that's probably an extreme minority event. And I do see this in my interviews, that I'm talking to people who are saying, yeah, I publish my code, but just like as a practice, nobody's using it. I don't expect anybody to use it. So the idea that we'll suddenly have people to review all this code, we don't have this now. We really have not had this historically for a lot of types of our code. And can we correct the literature when errors are found? I feel pretty pessimistic about this. So Retraction Watch is a really wonderful project it's a database of keeping tabs on retracted literature. Literature can be retracted for ethical reasons, if there's misconduct found, failure to disclose funders, but also for errors of analysis, errors in computation, methodological errors. It's really comprehensive. And so as of my last pull from this database, there are about 67,000 retractions in this database. And this is the best retraction database that we have. How many papers do you think there are? Order of magnitude. Yeah, so we have, in the papers that are indexed, in 2022, the number that was indexed by certain estimates is about 2.82 million. That's only grown, right? And I do think this will get worse as we have more predatory journals publishing kind of paper mill things. And also, I don't know if this has or hasn't happened, but I do hear a lot of speculation that the volume of papers can go up with LLM writing assistance, which is actually a fairly straining, could be quite straining on the number of papers to read and check. And errors are also slow to be caught through this process. So here's a paper. This came out in September 2023, and it was about post-COVID condition in children, which is also called long COVID in a lot of places. And so they found a very low incidence of cases of this long COVID in children, and it turned out that was a coding error. It was a result of sorting children into the wrong buckets through some assumptions in how missing data was handled. The true incidence was actually about 3 times as high as originally estimated, and this retraction is 1 year later. So I don't know how many decisions were made in this time based on findings like this, right? So if we have a 3-fold underestimate because of a coding error based on how people are binning and categorizing data, which is, that's not even very complicated code engineering. And I don't mean to cast any aspersions on the authors here, because I think they're working under a set of conditions that are quite typical, and they probably were doing their best with the training that they had and the infrastructure they have. But this is a very long time to correct an issue like this that has a public health implication. And it's just really different from a lot of other kinds of software. Like I was talking with I have a colleague who's a data engineer at a really big shoe company, and he was saying that when they have a pricing model that fails, they find out that night. If they ship a model and all of a sudden their numbers start going, you know, it's really screwing with their sales, they see that in hours and they can correct that. We don't have anything like that scale of feedback on a major issue like this in science. So I would say that we don't currently have a scalable or fast mechanism for correcting serious code issues once they're published in the literature, and we also don't have very standardized methods for detecting those errors before they are sent out. So to get to the end here, I want to talk about 3 worrying bad scenarios that I'm thinking about, none of which are inevitable, although I don't necessarily have solutions myself for them. I think that's kind of, I don't know, it's a community ask. And also assuming no deus ex machina. So I suppose there's always the possibility that, you know, the tooling changes drastically in the next couple years, and I'm really bad at predicting those things, and so I try not to. So I'm hoping that this exercise is worth thinking through without having to make a strong prediction about where code tooling is going to go in the next few years. So I guess one really bad scenario is that the quality of the scientific literature slowly and quietly degrades because we don't have good feedback signals on which findings could be based on really questionable code. And so I think that this could be worse in fields where software development practices and reuse are uncommon. So I feel more confident about fields that have a lot of code reuse, that code is shared by the community. I think people are more likely to catch those things or to develop some institutional knowledge about, you know, how things should behave in our code and what's suspect, and to pass that on. I think in cases like this public health example, where it's very possible that the person who did that code was just the grad student in the lab who's the only one who can program, and there's not really a review process on it, which is a tremendous amount of pressure for that one programmer in the lab. And so if there is essentially, you know, more code with quieter errors, and we don't have any change in what kind of opportunities we have for feedback, I could see a quiet degradation where it takes us years to figure out that an unknown number of papers in any given literature are based on weird ChatGPT code choices. Another risk I would be concerned about here is de-investment in scientific software. So thinking about what makes people feel productive, it's the writing, it's the I'm making lots of code, right? And you're especially likely to feel productive when you don't have any feedback avenues that are set up, you know, in your group about what's going on in your code. And so my concern would be that if this is what drives perceptions of productivity, we could have decision makers who are saying, well, I'm coding now. Look at how much code I'm making with ChatGPT. So I'm not sure that I need any software support. And I don't know that this is happening. And in some cases, it's really great that people who are not able to program much previously, like a PI who previously didn't have time, this might be the kind of lowering the activation barrier enough that now they're happily coding with Copilot again and they're back in it. But if it doesn't come with some kind of feedback about, well, are you actually more productive in terms of creating quality code, or are you mostly generating lines of code, that sort of puts people in a low feedback zone where I think they might be biased towards thinking, I'm so productive, I actually don't need coding help from engineers anymore. That would be my concern. So are we going to obscure the value of software craftsmanship because we don't have very visible feedback in a lot of locations about what happens when you get software craftsmanship very, very wrong? I also think about a public trust crisis. So I'm imagining a really high-profile paper, maybe on something like vaccines or global warming, especially during, you know, a really critical moment in public health, or, you know, a kind of an emergency crisis situation like we had during the pandemic, where papers were coming out fast, right? We were really fast-tracking things, and so if someone puts their code on GitHub and it turns out that hundreds of lines of it are just ChatGPT and, you know, pretty poorly done. It's not really tested. It doesn't really match what they're saying it does, which I think could happen. And that's online. That is a public crisis, you know, of trust right there waiting to happen, where someone finds that and says, look at what they're making their decisions based on. This is not acceptable to be the basis of, you know, decisions that affect thousands, millions of people. And I think this already does happen to a degree. I mean, so this is an example from 2020. This is Imperial College London was open sourcing a lot of the code that they were using for COVID spread simulations. And this is a family of models that is quite, historic. It's really well understood. So it actually makes sense to me to some degree why there aren't tests for this, just because of the kind of testing is, what sort of outputs are typical for this model because of they're like the bedrock of a lot of epidemiology. But this gets online, and then these software, engineers, or people who, I don't know who they are, but, people who are saying, this doesn't match the standards whatsoever of what I would expect from a software project. You have no tests here. And so, this person commenting, and there's, several other high-level comments like this, along with many, reactions. These are threads that have, many, many, many follow-up comments, saying billions of lives have been disrupted worldwide on the basis that the study produced by the logic contained in this code base is accurate. And since there are no tests to show that, the finding of this study and any others based on this code base are not a sound basis for public policy at this time, right? And so it's fairly easy for me to imagine this sort of criticism being circulated and weaponized. And, I don't know what the intentions of this person are, but that looks like a pretty valid critique to me of you're making these decisions about our lives, and what quality control have you put into this? What makes you sure that this is correct? And so I think that that's really possibly a fault line for public trust that we could see in the future. And I could see that getting a lot worse if the code quality becomes, really questionable or really questionably related to what the experimenters are saying it does. So, opportunities. This is my last slide. What can we do? One thing I'm thinking about is, are scientists using the right tools for the job? And I would argue if people are just defaulting to ChatGPT, probably not. I don't know that that's the ideal tool for most people who want to program. It is a really nice interface. Beginners love a conversational interface, but it really doesn't put many guardrails on what you can ask it for. And it might be, preferable to have tools that really are targeted for developers, scientific developers, and put some guardrails on what you can ask for, and kind of will steer you towards better principles. Obviously, I don't know what exactly that would look like, or if people would want to use those tools. But if it's just ChatGPT that's being used, I suspect that's kind of as a default, and not because of a lot of exploration of what's possible. I also think that this code translation need is really present for a lot of scientists, and so could we develop for that sort of support? And that doesn't have to mean direct translation. That can mean, what can we make that would facilitate, either better search from within your IDE of documentation, and that can be facilitated by the kind of large language model embeddings that are possible without having to generate, dozens of lines of code necessarily either, right? Like, we can use large language models in ways that don't require us to be primarily generating first, right? Like, that's not the only mode we can use them in. So I think thinking about this use case, because it's really prevalent, could be quite interesting. Another thing is, how much corporate dependence are we comfortable with? If the majority of scientists that I'm seeing that use an AI tool are using ChatGPT, that's a tool that we could, in theory, be price gouged out of any day, right? That concerns me. I know for people that work on, using LLMs as part of their data pipeline, using a private tool may not meet the requirements for transparency and reproducibility that's required for science. Is that also true for programming? Beyond software, I think we should be thinking about the effects of the scientific literature, right? So thinking about, we're not just trying to produce code, we're trying to produce knowledge, and the knowledge needs to be trustworthy, it needs to be reliable, and we need to have some mechanisms for, revising as we find mistakes. So how do we ensure that the quality of the scientific literature, stays, I don't even know if I would say stays strong, because if there are real issues already, but, really not degrading this or breaking this. And I want to finish by saying that research software experts do have influence. I mean, a theme that I hear during interviews is that when people are navigating these tools and they're not sure about programming and they're not really sure how to do things, when there's a research software engineer present in their lab, you know, that person does have a lot of influence on their attitudes about different tools, about, you know, if they're aware of things like code testing or using a GitHub repository, like those things matter. So people really are looking for that kind of feedback. And the fact that most people don't have access to an expert like that, I think it's not that they wouldn't want to use that resource if it were, you know, available. It's that they don't know a person like that. And that does give me a lot of hope for, you know, communities like this and, you know, potentially getting to set some of the standards and the conversations that we're going to be having in the sciences for many years. So let's open up for questions, ideas. Yeah, thank you, everyone.